So I was a bit alarmed when Tina emailed me and told me she wanted me to talk about death, because I thought, what the fuck? What do I know about death? And I started thinking about it, and it occurred to me that I've spent the last 7 or 8 years actually not talking about death, but inspired by death. I've done a lot of personal work over the last 7 or 8 years, and it's all been started by death. But death is never the subject. Death is never the point of it. It's just been sort of instigated by death. The first thing I ever did was in 2006 when my mother died, and I found myself taking care of my dad. And I spent 3 years taking care of him. But this is not a project about death or dementia or sadness. It's a project about love. This work, Days with My Father, is a love letter from me to my dad. So I spent 3 years, or 2 years actually, doing that. And like everything, I have a slightly peculiar sense of humor. And I mean it. I really mean it when I say it's not about death, because it's about everything that is involved in life. It's about beauty and about sadness, about fragility, about humor. So this work really changed how I am as an artist. It changed everything for me, in fact. It made me realize that I could make sense of the world and to make sense of things that were happening to me through art, which I know is not really a huge revelation, but it was for me at the time. This is another project also about death, and this is really literally about death. This is a thing I did about my sister who died when I was a kid. And after my parents died, I found this box of things that had belonged to her, and I spent 3 years kind of summoning the courage to take photographs of them and to write about them. But what was extraordinary to me is that it was a gift. In some ways, death is an extraordinary gift because it gives you the opportunity to look at things. So when I was 6, gave me the chance to rediscover my sister and to understand my parents and the courage they had to not bury me along with my sister. And also, it gave me an incredible sense of gratitude for the life they gave me. And I'm talking about these things because I'm trying to give you a sense of context for what I'm going to talk about now, which is a project I did a couple of years ago called Maybe. Between 2006 and 2009, there was sort of like a Toledano, that's my last name, sort of mass extinction event. Everyone who mattered to me and my family died in those 3 years. My mother, my father, my aunt, my uncle. It was a very, very small family, and everyone just disappeared. And I thought about this a lot, which I guess is normal. And I became really obsessed with this idea of this notion that you have no idea of what lies ahead of you in life. You have no sense of what's in store. I can remember so clearly what I was doing the day my father called me to say that my mother had fallen down and she wasn't getting up and something was wrong. And that was the day that I went over there, and 3 days later my mom was dead and I was taking care of my dad. But my life would changed radically at that very moment. And I had no idea that that moment was waiting for me. So I began to think about this obsessively, this idea of what might happen to me, what terrible, disastrous things are going to happen to me. I'd walk along the street and I'd see a homeless guy, and I'd think that at some point he was a happy child who had no idea that this was how his life was going to be. So, because I'm clearly nuts, I decided I was going to do a project where I would anticipate all the terrible things that would happen to me in my future. Which makes a lot of sense. My wife said, "Why don't you just go and see a shrink?" I said, no, I've got to do it this way. So I took a DNA test that told me what illnesses I was likely to get. I spoke to fortune tellers, tarot card readers, numerologists. I was hypnotized. And then that's the results of my DNA test. And then I worked with a prosthetics expert to become these different versions of my future self. So these are some of the plaster molds. And this is you'll see kind of the sequence. Basically, I would go to the studio and it would take 4 or 5 hours to get into makeup, and then I would live as this version of myself for the rest of the day. You're all looking at me like I'm barking mad now. It's very attractive. So there I'm an alcoholic. That was what one of the fortune tellers said I was going to end up being. This was one of the very first pictures I did, and this is what I used to do with my father. I would take him to the park, and I would text my friends while he fell asleep. So I was being my dad in this picture. And the extraordinary thing for me about doing this work was not that, it's not the pictures, it was the process. As you age over time, you do it incrementally over the course of 40 or 50 years, so you don't notice how the world sees you differently because it takes so long to age. But when you go from 45 to 95 in the space of a day, you see radically how the world sees you differently. And when you're 95 in a wheelchair, you don't matter anymore. You're invisible, you don't count. And so to feel that, even for a few hours, just a sense of what that must be like, to feel how the world saw me differently, that was the power in this work for me. One of the fortune tellers said she thought I was going to commit suicide, which was fantastic news to hear. So I said, all right, but she didn't really know how. I really was sort of, is it, what is autoerotic asphyxiation, which would have been fun, but sadly not. So I came up with this. This is actually one of my favorites. I asked that black woman, I said, can you just give me a look like I don't belong here? And then it was like it was like a radiation burn. I mean, I said she was amazing at it. But this work is not only about physical failure, but moral failure, or a loss of sense of self. So each shoot was like a movie shoot. I had to find locations, I had to find extras, I had to find, I actually hated this project. Every second of this project, I hated from start to finish. It was utterly miserable. And so that's why it took me 3 years to do. So this is me talking about death. Death is not the point of my work, but it's been the start of a lot of work. And even though it's brought me extraordinary sadness, it's also given me an incredible sense of clarity and gratitude. I mean, maybe is really in some ways about gratitude, because the thing about maybe that I realized was that I've lived an incredible, lucky and privileged life. And when you lead a lucky and privileged life, you always assume it will continue to be lucky and privileged. And so when terrible things happen, you're surprised by that. And so this work was me understanding that life is not always roses, which I know is such a magnificently dumb thing to end on. But it takes death to make you realize that. Thank you for listening.